Sure, yeah. I mean, this grew out of really the work that I did in Tanzania, as you say, when I was living with indigenous communities, and just noticing the connection with nature and the very creative lifestyles.
What happens when two unlikely people fall in love? Do their different worlds align to support them? Or do they pose a threat to their union? Just ask Gemma Burford, who was only 21 years old when her charity trip to Tanzania changed her entire life. When Gemma first crossed paths with a Maasai warrior, never in a million years did the young woman expect that she would be smitten by him. And it wasn't hard to see why. Their worlds were entirely different, and they just seemed incompatible. But the stars aligned in their favor, and despite the contrast in their backgrounds, their love defied all odds, leading to a marriage that captivated hearts. However, their union wasn't without challenges. Cultural differences, societal expectations, and personal sacrifices threatened their bond. And as their relationship teetered on the edge, many wondered if this unlikely couple would survive. So, what happened to Gemma and her Maasai warrior? Were they able to rise above the challenges? And where is Gemma today? Let's find out. The encounter. It was March 1999, about 2 decades after Tanzania became independent from British colonial rule. At the time, Tanzania was a country in transition, and although it was politically stable, the economy was in shambles. Poverty was on the rise, infrastructure was limited, and the country relied very heavily on international aid. Thanks to the country's economic state, at the time, it wasn't unusual for charity groups from all around the world to foray into Tanzania to help as much as they could. And when 21-year-old Gemma Burford happened across such an opportunity, she saw this as her chance to give back to the community and satisfy her curiosity. At the time, she was a brilliant Oxford student studying biomedical science. And even though she already felt fulfilled in her academic life, she craved an adventure. And exploring the vastly misunderstood continent of Africa was an itch she couldn't scratch. So, she packed up her bags and journeyed to East Africa with nothing but her curiosity and desire fueling her. Little did she know that she would have an encounter that would change her life forever. Upon arriving in the beautiful country, the first thing Gemma noticed was that the Tanzanian sun shimmered over the dusty roads of Arusha, painting everything in a golden hue. The country was beautiful. The air was fresh and untainted, with the smoke and grime of her British city. But Gemma had only planned to stay in Tanzania for 2 weeks. Even though it was for charity, this was still a holiday for her. It was a break from academia that would end after 14 days. However, as she stepped into a bustling arts and crafts fair in Arusha, surrounded by the vivid reds and blues of Maasai shukas, the rhythmic beats of drums, and the scent of firewood smoke, something shifted inside her. And it wasn't just a result of the scenery, it was the people. And in that moment, surrounded by a rich blend of art and culture, that's when she saw him. He was tall, his skin shone underneath the golden sun, and he was dressed in the traditional attire of his people. Layers of bright fabric, intricate beadwork, and sandals crafted from old tires. He hadn't said a single word to Gemma, but to her, he exuded quiet confidence, a kind of grounded pride that couldn't be faked. Their eyes met, and that's when she felt the spark. It was just a glance, but even without speaking or holding eye contact for a longer period, something passed between them. Gemma would later find out his name, Lesikar. He spoke no English, and Gemma spoke no Ma, so communication between them didn't look too promising. Still, when he greeted her with a soft, "Hello," she smiled. At that moment, language didn't matter. There was something magnetic in his presence. After that brief encounter, they parted ways. But fate has an interesting way of materializing, and for this duo, destiny wasn't quite finished. A few days later, Gemma ran into Lesikar again. Thankfully, this time around, he was with friends who spoke some English. They were nice to her and even told her about a charity initiative called Ang Serian, which aimed to protect and celebrate Maasai traditions in the face of modernization. Moved by their passion for their culture, she promised to stay in touch. Soon, however, her 14 days were up, and she had to return to the UK to complete her Oxford education. But Gemma knew her life would never remain the same. Tanzania had already left a mark on her heart, and there was just a certain man's smile she couldn't get out of her head. What happened next? Back in England, life resumed. Gemma completed her degree and began working with a medical research company in Oxford. Although she would later admit that slipping back into her old life in Oxford wasn't exactly easy. Still, she found comfort in her growing friendship with Alex, a personal management student she'd known through work. She recalled they'd been friends for a long time. We were very comfortable with each other, so our friendship grew into romance easily. Gemma was also fairly accomplished. She had a wonderful job, an Oxford degree, and had even gone to Tanzania for charity. But that was the feeling she couldn't shake off. Tanzania. What was it about this country in East Africa that made her feel her journey wasn't over? Gemma was determined to find out. So when an opportunity arose in May 2000 to help organize a medical conference in Arusha, she didn't hesitate. Fast forward to December 2000, while flying to Tanzania for a work project, Gemma found herself gripped by fear during a terrifying mid-air ordeal. It was a moment of clarity. Up until that point, I thought I was in love with Alex, she says. But when the plane landed, the first person I wanted to talk to, apart from my mum and dad, was Lesikar. Lesikar, the Maasai warrior she'd met the year before, had clearly left a deeper mark on her heart than she'd allowed herself to admit. Still, Gemma tried to push those feelings aside. I kept telling myself, don't fall in love with a man who lives on the other side of the world. But inevitably, I started to notice Lesikar's muscles, his lovely smile, and when his hand touched mine, the chemistry was obvious. Even then, she didn't say a word. She flew home once her work ended, trying to forget the feelings that were bubbling beneath the surface. But fate had other plans. In April 2001, Gemma was asked to return to Tanzania for another 6-month project. Lesikar agreed to be her translator once again, and almost immediately, things began to change. Just a few days in, a cheeky taxi driver asked Lesikar, "So when are you going to marry this lady?" Both of them blushed, but the moment stuck. This time, they spent more time together. They talked, clumsily at first, through translators and laughter and shared gestures. Gemma was fascinated by his world, the tight-knit community, the traditions passed down orally, the fierce pride in identity. And Lesikar, in turn, was drawn to her curiosity, her kindness, and her willingness to listen. It was after the ordeal with the taxi driver that Gemma decided it was time to be honest. Back at the hotel, I told him I had something important to say. He just sat there patiently, and I finally blurted out, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Lesikar smiled. "We've been in love for a long time," he said softly, and then he kissed her. It was wonderful, Gemma remembers. In Masai culture, a man doesn't need to ask a woman to marry him. Love is enough. If he tells her he loves her, marriage is simply understood. Gemma explained that Lesikar never actually proposed. It was just assumed we'd get married. The very next morning, she sent an email to Alex. "I've met someone else and I know it's serious," she wrote. Looking back, she shared that Alex was more offended that I dumped him by email than by the fact I was leaving him. Next came the call home. She recalled that she told her dad, Peter, a retired accountant first. Her mum, Sue, a retired librarian, had refused to come on the phone because she was too upset. However, Gemma followed up with a long email, explaining how happy she was, how certain she felt. Her mother eventually responded, "I'm just worried about you getting hurt." When Gemma returned to England for a brief visit, she was struck by the reactions of her family. Sue was initially stunned. Her daughter, who had always been so composed and determined, was now engaged to a Maasai warrior she had met on a charity trip. The news left her mother speechless, struggling to understand the depth of Gemma's feelings for someone so far removed from her world. Peter, though more reserved, had his own reservations. His only child was about to marry a man from a rural African village, a world he couldn't fathom. But despite their concerns, both parents could see the change in Gemma, the contentment, the peace in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not even her previous boyfriend, Alex, had made her so happy. Lesikar was the man who made her smile in a way she hadn't before, and that was something her parents couldn't ignore for long. On the other side of the world, Lesikar told his family the news. They were shocked, too. One afternoon, while walking through the hills of a Maasai village, he took Gemma to meet his mother. Here, he introduced her not as a tourist, but as someone special. That was the moment Gemma realized her holiday had become something much deeper. She wasn't just passing through. She was slowly becoming part of a world she never expected to enter. As Gemma later described it, "I didn't fall in love with an exotic fantasy. I fell in love with a real person, in a very real culture. And that changed everything." In June 2001, her parents finally agreed and flew to Arusha to meet Lesikar and his family. It was quite the adventure. "Mom has asthma and a bad leg," Gemma explained. She really didn't enjoy the hike to Lesikar's village or sleeping in a hut on a bed made of cowhide. There were chickens and goats behind a thin partition, which didn't help her get much rest. "It didn't go perfectly to plan," Gemma admitted, "but Mom put on a brave face, and I know Dad had a good time." By September, Lesikar visited England for the first time. His English had improved, and her parents got to know him better. Slowly but surely, they gave their blessing. The wedding was set for December. Gemma packed up her life in Oxford for good. Her mother, though still coming to terms with everything, had one condition. When it came time to start a family, Gemma had to come home to the UK to give birth in a proper hospital. "That was the only thing Mum insisted on," Gemma said. But overall, she didn't feel like I'm giving anything up, as she truly believed she would be gaining so much more. But boy, did everything change. It wasn't easy for the duo. There were cultural gaps, linguistic hurdles, and the looming question of how two people from such different worlds could build a shared life. But those concerns could wait. For now, all that mattered was that spark and the story that was only just beginning. From visitor to wife. It was insane, but exciting. As the weeks rolled by, Gemma's journey had started to take an unexpected turn. From the curious visitor who was smitten by a man and his culture, she was treading the path of becoming a Maasai bride. When she struggled with the cultural nuances or tried to understand the customs of the Maasai people, Lesikar would patiently explain, often using a blend of broken English and expressive hand motions. It was clumsy at times, but it worked. Over time, Gemma began to notice the subtle shifts within herself. She no longer felt the stark separation between her world in England and Lesikar's life in the Tanzanian village. She learned to appreciate the unspoken rhythms of village life, the ebb and flow of communal living. Her days began with a peaceful routine, waking up at dawn to the sound of roosters crowing, preparing simple meals over an open flame, and chatting with the women of the village in their own quiet, shared moments. The gestures had become more than just communication. They were an expression of a relationship that transcended language. But the most challenging changes were yet to come. Meanwhile, in Lesikar's village, the reactions were mixed, but no less intense. Some members of the community were curious about this foreign woman who had entered their world so seamlessly. Others viewed Gemma with suspicion. She was an outsider, a visitor in a culture that had remained largely untouched by the modern world. There was skepticism. Would she be able to live as they did, without the comforts of electricity, running water, and other luxuries that she had grown up with? But as the days passed and Gemma became more involved in village life, those initial doubts began to fade. She had a quiet strength about her that spoke volumes. She didn't try to change things. She simply adapted, learning quickly how to move within the flow of Maasai life. The wedding ceremony was a grand celebration. It was traditional, deeply rooted in Maasai culture, and every detail was significant. The air was filled with song and dance as the village came together to celebrate the union of Gemma and Lesikar. The ceremony itself was a mixture of vibrant color and spiritual rituals, with elders offering blessings and members of the community participating in dances that had been passed down for generations. They even slaughtered a goat in her honor. Gemma, dressed in her Maasai bridal attire, stood by Lesikar as the elder pronounced them husband and wife, her heart swelling with emotion. The marriage, while joyous, also marked the beginning of many lifestyle changes for Gemma. No longer would she live in the comfort of her modern home in England. Instead, she was about to embrace a radically different life, one that required her to leave behind the conveniences of the Western world. She moved into their new home, a 4-room shack held together with cow dung and cement, a quarter of a mile from the nearest water pump. Although it cost around £2,000 to build, it was a far cry from the 4-bedroom detached home in the picturesque village of Old Bursleden Hants, where Gemma, an only child, grew up with her parents. By village standards, it was a mansion. His family couldn't understand why I wanted so much space, Gemma said. She was already shaking up tradition by planning to install an electric hob and solar panels. But even though some things couldn't be modernized, Gemma didn't mind. She threw herself into her new life, fundraising for the village school, teaching English, and making jewelry. "I never wanted to be part of the rat race," she says. "A swish city lifestyle was never really for me. I've never been that interested in material things." Things were changing and fast. The privately educated career girl who passed 14 GCSEs before graduating from Exeter College, Oxford, with a degree in biomedical science, was now taking a completely different step to what many had previously envisioned for her. Gone was the dream of settling down to a profession in Oxford, with marriage, a mortgage, and motherhood. In was the reality of her new life, a union with a man with a drastically different background. Lesikar had grown up with 16 brothers and sisters. He was the son of a herdsman and was raised in a 1-bed shack. And even though he attended a local school, he had no formal qualifications. So, what was it about this man that so deeply captivated Gemma? It was love, she said. And after their union, she wasted no time in moving in with him into the heart of the village, where there was no electricity, no running water, and no modern conveniences. At first, Gemma was overwhelmed by the physicality of village life. She had to fetch water from a nearby well, which meant carrying heavy containers over uneven ground, sometimes for miles. There were no showers, only the simplicity of bathing under the open sky in the cool waters of a nearby stream. Cooking over an open fire became a daily ritual, one that required patience and a deep respect for the earth and its resources. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and Gemma quickly learned to enjoy the warmth it provided. But these challenges were also where Gemma experienced her deepest transformation. She wasn't just learning how to survive in this environment, she was learning how to thrive in it. Her initial discomfort slowly faded into a quiet contentment. She found joy in the simplicity of her new life. The women of the village, who once viewed her with uncertainty, now became her teachers. They showed her how to weave baskets, how to prepare traditional Maasai dishes, and how to navigate the unspoken rules of community life. With each passing day, Gemma became more connected to the land and its people. She began to understand the rhythm of life here, the quiet hum of the earth beneath her feet, the soothing sound of the wind through the trees, the beauty of the stars in the endless Tanzanian sky. She realized that she had stepped into a world that was both vastly different from her own, and yet somehow the same. People in the village might not have the luxuries of modern life, but they had something far more valuable: a connection to the land, to one another, and to their rich cultural heritage. But even though she had settled into a daily routine, Gemma still felt very unfulfilled, and the cracks in their union were starting to show. Challenges of a cross-cultural marriage. Gemma's life in Tanzania was far from the romantic adventure she had envisioned. While she was deeply in love with Lesikar, the challenges that arose from their vastly different cultures began to create significant strain on their relationship. Communication was one of the first and most obvious hurdles. Even though they eventually found a way around it, in the beginning, their relationship relied heavily on communication, making it hard for them to understand each other. Misunderstandings were frequent, and Gemma often felt isolated, struggling to express herself fully. A simple conversation would sometimes turn into a misunderstanding, leading to frustration on both sides. For Gemma, this was one of the hardest parts of the transition. The lack of a common language meant that many of the complexities of her thoughts, needs, and desires were left unspoken, building emotional walls she had not anticipated. But this challenge wasn't as significant as the cultural differences Gemma faced. The role of women in Maasai society was very much different from her British one. In Maasai culture, women are expected to be obedient and take on the responsibilities of homemaking, childcare, and supporting their husbands' decisions without question. This was in stark contrast to Gemma's Western upbringing, where independence and equality were emphasized. So it was a change Gemma found a bit difficult to settle into. Her new role as a wife in the Maasai community was far removed from her previous life. While Gemma tried her best to adapt, the expectations placed on her were sometimes overwhelming. Lesikar, who had grown up with these cultural norms, sometimes struggled to understand Gemma's desire for a more balanced partnership. Jealousy, too, became a concern. The Maasai practiced polygamy, and while Lesikar had assured Gemma that she would be his only wife, tensions arose when she saw him interacting with other women in the village. The weight of tradition was something she had to navigate carefully, not only in her relationship, but also in her place within the community. To make matters worse, she had to walk miles just to get adequate health care. And it didn't help that living in a remote village brought with it health challenges that Gemma had not anticipated. Access to health care was limited. While she had grown up in the UK, where medical services were easily accessible, the nearest clinic was a few hours away on foot. When Gemma fell ill, there were no quick solutions, and the treatment options were basic at best. She often relied on herbal remedies and traditional Maasai healing methods, which didn't always align with the medical knowledge she was accustomed to. The lack of proper medical care took an emotional toll. When Gemma became sick, she found herself feeling vulnerable and helpless, and it made her question her decision to live in such isolation. It also brought to light the emotional strain that her new life was placing on her well-being. Lesikar, while supportive, couldn't always understand the depth of her struggles because of the stark difference in their cultural backgrounds. Then there was the challenge of being the only white woman in the village. What came with it was a deep sense of isolation, as she was often seen as an outsider. While the community had accepted her marriage to Lesikar, Gemma felt the constant weight of being different. The Maasai, who had very little exposure to people from outside their community, were curious but cautious, and Gemma was often viewed through a lens of curiosity. This sense of alienation sometimes made her feel lonely, despite the love she had for her husband. She missed the familiarity of her home in the UK, the ease of walking down the street without being stared at, and the comfort of speaking to someone who understood her in ways that Lesikar, despite his love for her, couldn't. Although she tried her best to bring some elements of her life from the West into their marriage, Gemma wanted to find a balance between her modern values and the traditional Maasai way of life. She introduced new ideas for improving the quality of life in the village, such as teaching women how to read and write, which she hoped would empower them. She also tried to integrate modern concepts into their everyday life, such as improving hygiene practices and introducing more efficient cooking methods. While some villagers embraced her ideas, others resisted, preferring to stick with their traditional ways. Gemma's efforts were met with mixed reactions. Her attempts to blend the worlds often created a rift between her and Lesikar, as he saw some of her ideas as too foreign and unnecessary. Over time, the pressure of reconciling two different cultures began to put a strain on their relationship. The cultural expectations of a Maasai wife were ever present, and Gemma found it difficult to navigate the fine line between honoring tradition and maintaining her identity. The emotional toll of feeling isolated and misunderstood, coupled with the constant tension around gender roles and expectations, began to weigh heavily on her. For Gemma, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile the love she felt for Lesikar with the sacrifices she had to make to maintain her place in his world. The breaking point. Although her mother had wanted her to have her kids in the UK, Gemma ultimately gave birth to their first child, Lucia, in Tanzania. The year was 2004, and at the time, she'd been with Lesikar for about 3 years. Even though she'd conveniently lived in a thatched roof hut, relying on a communal lifestyle, the experience of bringing children into such a different culture was very challenging for Gemma. Despite their efforts, the couple's relationship lasted only until 2010. By this time, they'd already welcomed a second daughter. But not even the beauty of his monogamous family and his love for his wife could stop Lesikar from following Maasai tradition. The pressure of taking other wives was mounting, and as the years tied by, Gemma knew it was only a matter of time before he finally caved. It was at this moment that she knew she had to leave. She had to give her daughters a different life from this. She had to recall her past dreams of making a change in the world. And even though she was content with helping the local community in any way she could, she wanted more. The decision to return to the UK was heartbreaking but necessary. Upon her return, Gemma faced a reverse culture shock. Things and times had changed, and she had to rebuild her life from scratch, adjusting back to life in a modern, urban environment. She pursued further education and research, particularly in the fields of traditional and alternative medicine, which aligned with her experiences in Tanzania. Gemma also took steps to help her daughters integrate back into British society, balancing their Maasai heritage with their new life in the UK. Even though we don't know much about them, we know that they're proud of their Maasai roots. Now back in the UK, Gemma acknowledges the emotional and psychological challenges of being in rural Tanzania, but also recognizes the growth and resilience she gained. Despite the end of her marriage, she still maintains a connection to Tanzania. She continues to visit and remains engaged with the community that once was her home. Since leaving her marriage, Gemma's experience has been widely shared. She wrote about her time in Tanzania in a book titled, and her story has garnered attention both from media outlets and documentary filmmakers. One such documentary covers her life with Lesikar, including their time in Tanzania and what led to their eventual separation. Today, Gemma lives in the UK, continuing her professional career in research and academia. She's involved in projects that focus on sustainable development and traditional medicine, topics that were influenced by her time in Tanzania. She also remains a passionate advocate for cross-cultural relationships and women's empowerment. In her own way, Gemma still continues to support the communities there, having funded education and development projects during her visits. And although she no longer has a close relationship with Lesikar, they still maintain a level of cordiality. She occasionally visits Tanzania, and while their marriage ended, they continue to share mutual respect. Lesikar, who still lives in Masai, is involved in community work, though the details of his current life are largely private. The separation was difficult, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter for both. What do you think of Gemma's story? Will you ever leave your home behind for love? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. To enjoy more exciting videos, click play on the video on your screen. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when a new video drops.